subject of AGOA. So AGOA essentially is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. This was a US law passed in year 2000 under the US Trade and Development Act. And it was intended to provide expanded opportunity for trade and investment by sub-Saharan African countries, thus spurring economic development in our region. Essentially what the US government and the US, all the stakeholders did was basically agree to expand the GSP list so that a number of what was previously deemed to be sensitive products were then added to the list of GSP-like provisions. So the eligible products now include about over 6,500 duty-free tariffs, which are eligible for entry into the US. AGOA has been renewed a number of times, and the most recent extension being in 2015 under President Obama, when it was extended for 10 years up until September of 2025. In terms of, next slide. In terms of country eligibility, we currently have 35 countries, and this number changes from year to year. There are countries which have recently acceded and obtained AGOA eligibility as a program. There are countries who, for one reason or another, were removed from eligibility, and there are countries who have been reinstated after being removed. So the number changes from year to year. I think last year it was 36, but now it's 35. Now, the criteria that are used by the US government to determine whether a country is eligible, they're similar in one way to the GSP requirements, but they're stated in a positive way rather than you should not do that. So it says that market-based economy that protects private property, examples like protection against child and forced labor, a system to combat corruption and bribery, and then economic policies to reduce poverty, increase availability of healthcare. There also should be elimination of barriers to US trade and investment, encouragement of the rule of law, political pluralism, and the right to due process and a fair trial. So in the cases where countries have had their status removed in the annual review that takes place, in some cases because of political issues, and some cases because of trade issues or setting up barriers to US trade investment. And we'll look later at some of the countries who have done well and not so well in this. Then we look at product eligibility. We talked about the over 6,500 products or tariff lines eligible under AGOA. This AGOA basically added a good number of what were deemed to be sensitive products, as well as adding a very, very generous textile, apparel rules of origin and eligibility, as well as incorporating, for instance, third country fabrics, so that you don't have to have a two-stage transformation. You can just have one-stage transformation. And I think this is key to the benefit of AGOA, because it provided almost 90% of the US import tariff lines were now eligible to be AGOA eligible. So people could export a wide range of products depending on their particular competitive advantage. You can see that the Africa Trade Platform website, you can go there and you can establish if a product is AGOA eligible, and the other resources which will be made available to you in the tools list after this presentation. So in terms of the products, we have two major types of products. We have the apparel products or textile products, and we have the non-apparel products. So they have slightly different eligibility criteria. If you look at the the non-apparel products, basically, okay, let's look at the general concepts. For anything to reach the US under AGOA, first of all, it must be included in the list of eligible products. We've discussed that at some length. It must be imported into the US directly. from the AGOA beneficiary country. It must also be the growth, product, or manufacture of the beneficiary country. We've discussed that also. And it must also be compliant if it's a textile product with a special rule for textiles and apparel. We'll discuss that in a minute. Looking at the next slide, non-textile products rules of origin. So basically non-textile products, their rules of origin are very similar to the ones we have for GSP. So we have 35%, in the rules of origin, we have 35% regional value being present in the appraised value of the product as it reaches the US port. So that can comprise of cost of materials produced in one or more AGOA eligible country, plus the direct cost of processing operations, all the things that you have to do to make that product in the factory, plus some of the things you have to do to get the product to the factory, with no more than 15% of that value coming from the US. And insignificantly, exporters must keep the documents that would be needed to justify that these products are AGOA eligible and meet the rules of origin. And they must also have certain documents like the certificate of origin, or in some cases, the textile visa, authorized by a responsible organization, for instance, the customs services in the respective countries. Next slide, please. Okay, if you look at the process for, the non-textiles, there are very important steps that the country must take in order to fulfill the textile goods rules of origin. So this is actually for textile goods rules of origin. The country must establish an apparel textile visa system, and the exporters must have the AGOA visa endorsed in the export documentation. In some countries, most countries, it's endorsed in the commercial invoice of the exporting party, and all those documents are conveyed together with the sealed container to the destination to make sure there has been no transshipment of goods. The textile visa was established in order to avoid illegal transshipment of goods made in another country being misrepresented as having been made in a beneficial developing country under AGOA. There's also, just to alert or clarify, there is no specific quota per se per country for the apparel benefits. So what we have is a collective regional cap. The regional cap varies depending on where the raw material comes from. So if the raw material comes, for instance, from a third country, let's say China or India, i.e. not US and not Africa, then the cap is 3.5% of the total apparel imported into the US in the previous year. However, if the fabric comes from the region, then it is available at a level of 7% of total US imports. And you can imagine the US imports over $83 billion of apparel every year. So it's a huge amount of trade. And I don't think we've reached anywhere near any of those caps. In addition to the raw materials which are sourced internally, you can also obtain findings and trimmings. Those are things like hooks and eyes, sewing threads, elastic strips, up to 25% of the value of the assembled components. And you can also import certain components, such as collars and cuffs, drawstrings, packaging, padding, and so on. These are all part of the items that can be included without referring to the cap limit in terms of the raw material. Next slide. Now let's look at the apparel provisions. There are 10 types of apparel that can be exported to the US in terms of where the raw material originates and where the product is manufactured. So we have 10 categories. Next slide, please. First of all is what we call category 1A. That is apparel made of US yarns and fabrics, knit to shape, and with fabrics cut in the US. So that's where a whole cut operation has been done in the US and is brought for stitching here. That's eligible for AGOA. Category 2B again, 2, 3C, and all those. Those are on a kind of a continuum. So we can go to next slide. The one I'd like to point it is category 5E. Just go back one slide, please. Thank you. Category 5E is what we call the third country fabric sourcing provision. This provides for apparel assembled from fabric, regardless of the country of origin of the fabric or the yarn. This is what is known as third country fabric. So you can import under AGOA fabric from a non-AGOA country, not from the US, and you're able to manufacture it to produce apparel for export with the tariff benefits. Next slide. We also have additional categories, like what we call category 9. These are the special folkloric handmade handloom products, and these are defined in bilateral consultations between the US and the AGOA eligible country. And a good number of the countries are able to export these products according to the definition. They're usually much simpler in terms of less machine input, although there are a lot of handicraft and skill going into it. And they are pretty much defined according to the cultures and norms of that particular country. Category Not, as it's called, is also a significant addition. These are for textile articles originating entirely in one or more lesser developed country. So this includes things made of goods such as towels, blankets, sheets, floor coverings, bedspreads, all those kind of things you use in the home, mostly home textiles. All right, so how do we use these AGOA benefits? So it's very important for exporters and also importers in the US and exporters from our countries to understand the benefits, but more importantly, to understand how to use the system in order to expand their exports and take advantage of the tariff preferences. So we recommend that both the African exporters engage with stakeholders like ATP and the other programs in place to educate themselves, and also to be handheld or supported through the various programs to be able to export under AGOA. It's actually not that difficult. It just requires adequate preparation, follow the documents, and things can be reasonably straightforward. I would also encourage that the US parties, if you're interested in importing from an AGOA eligible country, you can engage with your customs broker in the US. You can also engage with the US Customs and Border Protection Agency, CPB, and also with private groups like the Corporate Council on Africa, the US Chamber of Commerce, American Apparel Footwear Association, and other bodies who are familiar with AGOA and know something about the requirements and procedures. Okay, let's look at the tariffs and the use of SPIs. SPI stands for Special Program Indicator. These are specific codes which are used to describe the origin of a product and are usually contained in the export documentation. For instance, the import entry and also the export entries. Here we have 4 codes: A for duty-free from any BDC, A plus duty-free for only the least developed BDCs. A star means that a particular tariff, really don't put it there, but it's just for noting, a particular tariff line is no longer duty-free for certain GSP eligible countries. And this is usually where a country for that particular product has exceeded its limit. And lastly, most importantly, is D for AGOA, duty-free for eligible beneficiary countries. Where do you get this information? Next slide. You get it from something called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the US. This is a listing of the tariff codes. It's a big document with, I think, 99 chapters, and each chapter has a different product group, but very straightforward. You can get it online, and you can see from there, you can identify under the special category, that's the second last column on the right, what particular programs or schemes are eligible. If it's D, that means it's eligible under AGOA. If it's A or A plus, it's eligible under GSP. That's one source. You can look at the US ITC website and you can get down there and see that. Next slide. If you go to agoa.info, that's a good resource also, in addition to, of course, ATP. And they have an online lookup system where you enter the particular description and you're able to check. You can also do like a filtered search using different filters. For instance, if it's A+, or if A, or if it's D, and so on. So list all the products which have those particular characteristics. Next slide. This is a screenshot of the US ITC lookup system. So I think in this particular case, I did this some time ago. I was looking for footwear. So it brings up the particular word that you put in, and it will bring up all the HTS US codes that include that particular word. And then if you look through the various columns, you'll see whether that is AGOA eligible or GSP eligible. So I'm showing you the different sites. You can use alternatives. Next slide, please. So what documents do you normally need to export under AGOA and also under GSP? Of course, if you're exporting from one of our countries, your customs will normally require you to fill out an export entry with the details. You also need to attach a commercial invoice, which describes the products, the packing, the quantity, the values. You need a bill of lading or airwheel bill, accompanied by a packing list. And then you need a certificate. Now, I know different countries have different certificates. These are usually approved in consultation with the customs authority and the US relevant US agencies. In my particular neck of the woods, we actually use the GSP certificate of origin. And in the case of the textiles, we also add the textile visa stamp, which is placed by the authority, in this case, the customs, on the relevant document, in most cases on the commercial invoice. Next slide. Now, if you're importing, it's the opposite way. And I would encourage somebody who wants to learn more to deal with their customs broker or engage with CPB. So you need to have the records to explain why that particular product actually qualifies. You, of course, will need to establish internal controls as an importer for periodic review of your accuracy of your declarations. You need to have shipping papers to show that the article moved from the BDC or AGOA country directly to the US or via an authorized route. And then you have records which you must maintain in case the US authorities want to come and see them up to, I think you're supposed to retain them up to 5 years from the date of shipment. Next slide. We're almost done, and then we'll be able to take questions. Okay, so these are some of the resources that are available for you to use, and we'll share the presentation and you'll be able to link to the various resources. But one of the most important resources that was developed using support from the US government under the various trade hubs were the national AGOA strategies. And there's a whole list of them in agoa.info. And what the strategy did was define for each country what they wanted to do in order to take advantage of AGOA. So they identified the trade trends, looked at the market opportunities, then identified the sectors they wanted to promote because they are best suited under AGOA, and then looked at strategic areas of focus to be addressed so that they can actually realize export growth. And we noticed that the countries which did focus on this process tended to have a higher chance of being successful. Next slide. So you can read for your particular country the AGOA strategies if you go to agoa.info. The other thing you can look at is the how-to guides. There are various how-to guides which have been produced either by national ministries or by USAID projects. I'll give you examples. In Uganda, there was the AGOA 101, which was produced in 2019. It's available on that Africa Trade platform. There was one for Kenya. There's one for Ghana, and which was done in 2021, and so on. There's also a basic AGOA's exporter's guide and checklist, which you can see there at agoa.info, and then an FAQ on the Africa Trade platform. So I'd encourage all of you, please read these resources and try and see if you can make the best possible use of them. Next. Now, there are institutions in the US that you should, particularly if an importer, but even if you're an exporter as well, that you should be familiar with. The first one is the Customs and Border Protection. And they're the key agency which handles tariff preferences. They are the ones who administer those duty-free benefits. And they also deal with rulings on interpretation of customs law as it applies to a particular scheme. The second very important group is the US Trade Representative, USTR. They develop and coordinate in US international trade policy and also assist to oversee trade negotiations. And they also administer the trade preference programs like AGOA. So for instance, they're the ones who advise the president during the annual review on a particular country's eligibility. Third is the USITC. USITC is under the Commerce Department, and they are a very useful resource. They have excellent reports. There's one they recently did in March on a review of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, its program usage, trends, and sectoral highlights. So you will get the link there and you'll be able to download that document. In addition to that, they're also the manager of the US HTSUS, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule that you witnessed earlier. They also maintain current statistics about trade under these programs. Last but not least is the OTEXA, Office of Textiles and Apparel. Again, they're under the US Commerce Department under ITA. And OTEXA works basically to support these other agencies of government to manage the tariff preferences, particularly under the textiles. So they look at quota limits and they look at any of the statistics and trends that are coming up. So if you look at those links, you'll be able to download the current status on any particular apparel and also footwear and bags. Their mandate expands to luggage and bags. So my last slide, I didn't do an actual presentation on that, but I think the elephant is in the room is what happens after 2025. And that's a question, of course, none of us may be able to answer, but suffice it to say that having seen that the GSP expired in 2020 and hasn't been renewed, and of course there are discussions which may be going on the same, I think as beneficiaries of AGOA, I think it's good to take a keen interest in what is going on, establish basically what processes are ongoing, work with your national governments, your trade associations, your chambers of commerce to understand to what extent the engagement has started, to see if there's any possibility or if there's a likelihood, which we would hope, that AGOA would be extended between 2025, because it has really transformed economies, it has changed people's lives, and it has made it possible for us to become exporters to the US. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That is very insightful, even for myself.
Project of AGOA. So AGOA essentially is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. This was a US law passed in year 2000 under the US Trade and Development Act. And it was intended to provide expanded opportunity for trade and investment by sub-Saharan African countries, thus spurring economic development in our region. Essentially what the US government and the US, all the stakeholders did was basically agree to expand the GSP list so that a number of what was previously deemed to be sensitive products were then added to the list of GSP-like provisions. So the eligible products now include about over 6,500 duty-free tariffs, which are eligible for entry into the US. AGOA has been renewed a number of times, and the most recent extension being in 2015 under President Obama, when it was extended for 10 years up until September of 2025. In terms of, next slide. In terms of country eligibility, we currently have 35 countries, and this number changes from year to year. There are countries which have recently acceded and obtained AGOA eligibility as a program. There are countries who, for one reason or another, were removed from eligibility, and there are countries who have been reinstated after being removed. So the number changes from year to year. I think last year it was 36, but now it's 35. Now, the criteria that are used by the US government to determine whether a country is eligible, they're similar in one way to the GSP requirements, but they're stated in a positive way rather than you should not do that. So it says a market-based economy that protects private property, examples like protection against child and forced labor, a system to combat corruption and bribery, and then economic policies to reduce poverty, increase the availability of healthcare. There also should be elimination of barriers to US trade and investment, encouragement of the rule of law, political pluralism, and the right to due process and a fair trial. So in the cases where countries have had their status removed in the annual review that takes place, in some cases because of political issues, and some cases because of trade issues or setting up barriers to US trade investment. And we'll look later at some of the countries who have done well and not so well in this. Then we look at product eligibility. We talked about the over 6,500 products or tariff lines eligible under AGOA. This AGOA basically added a good number of what were deemed to be sensitive products, as well as adding a very, very generous textile, apparel rules of origin and eligibility, as well as incorporating, for instance, third country fabrics, so that you don't have to have a two-stage transformation. You can just have one-stage transformation. And I think this is key to the benefit of AGOA, because it provided almost 90% of the US import tariff lines were now eligible to be AGOA eligible. So people could export a wide range of products depending on their particular competitive advantage. You can see that the Africa Trade Platform website, you can go there and you can establish if a product is AGOA eligible, and the other resources which will be made available to you in the tools list after this presentation. So in terms of the products, we have two major types of products. We have the apparel products or textile products, and we have the non-apparel products. So they have slightly different eligibility criteria. If you look at the non-apparel product,